When I was in grade 8, my school class went camping, and I had sort of misunderstood something. I went to a church, we had a boys brigade that was very active. We did a lot of camping, but our camping is what we called cooler camping. And basically we would park the vehicles and we would go as far in as we could with the coolers, which is usually under 20 meters. And the important part of the camping was not what we were going to be, where we were going to be going exactly, but what was inside the cooler. And there was sort of a competitive edge to the food piece, so you wanted to have a lot of really good quality food. So in grade 8, when I was preparing for this camping trip, that's sort of how I was thinking as I loaded my backpack. I went to the grocery store, I found some amazing food, loaded it up, and got everything in my backpack. And it weighed about 75 pounds, which doesn't sound like a lot. It didn't seem that bad when I loaded it into the car, but I was probably only about 125 pounds at the time. I thought I was going to be okay though. However, the first half hour, I realized I should have maybe listened more carefully at school. After the first hour, things started to hurt. The second hour, I was suffering badly. By the third hour, I was ready to curl up in a ball and cry on the side and call for my mom, but you can't do that when you're a grade 8 boy, so I suffered through, and I eventually did make it. I barely made it to our site that night, and I'm assuming some people were wondering what was wrong with me, whether I had some sort of underlying health condition. But it all became apparent when I pulled out my cast iron frying pan and cooked my steak that night, and people understood my struggle. And if you ask me, was it worth it? I would say absolutely not. It was a terrible idea. Some things are just not worth carrying uphill that long, and it just about killed me. I enjoyed the food, but not enough to ever do it again. And I remember that very, very well, even though that was a lot of years ago. I was going to just read in Isaiah chapter 46, God is talking to his people, and he's making an argument, basically saying, I want you to think about the things you put your touch in, the things you carry. And in the beginning of the chapter, he says this to his people, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops. Their idols are beasts and livestock. Their idols are on beasts and livestock. These things you carry are borne as burdens on weary beasts. They stoop, they bow down together. They cannot save the burden, but themselves go into captivity. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel who have been born by me before your birth, carried from the womb. Even to your old age I am he, and to gray hairs I will carry you. I have made, and I will bear. I will carry, and will save. Later in the chapter, he talks about these people as they construct these gods, as they weigh out gold and silver, give them to a craftsman, fashion a god, put it in a prominent place, and it works well as long as life is going well. But when things fall apart, in this case, when their nation breaks down, all of a sudden these gods come off the shelf and they're loaded up on their animals as they flee into captivity. And you find the value of what you trust in troubled times. They look to these gods for safety and for happiness, and these gods utterly fail them. They carry them, they're loaded up on the beast, but they're more of a burden than anything else. They're dead weight. Their only value is the gold and silver they were fabricated from. And God comes in and says to his people, I want you to think about this. You can choose a God that you have to carry, that you have to manage, or you can consider me as your God. I carried you before you were born. He talks about being there for their conception, carried you since you were conceived, carried since your birth. And then he reminds us, even in the old age, even with gray hair, I've carried you. There's some good things about getting older. I'm super excited about my discount at Shoppers Drug Mart in a couple of years. But there's a lot of bad things. I know somebody that injured themselves cutting bread, not from the sharpness of the knife, but from just the sawing back and forth, a bad shoulder injury. You start to forget where your keys are. And God says, even in the old age, you may have heard some interesting things said about older people during COVID, but God says, even in that time, I will carry you and I'll sustain you. God says, I've always been there and I've always carried you. You can trust in the God that you would make, or you can trust in the God that made you and who has always carried you. He says these words, I will sustain you, I've made you, I will carry you, I will sustain you, and I will rescue you. There are a lot of places we can put our trust, and God challenges us and says, I want you to think about the value of the places where you put your trust. And particularly in those times when things get a little sketchy, a little tough, you can tell the value of a God by their power. And God says, I've always been there, I've always been faithful, and I won't sing the song, but that's one thing I've learned in my lifetime is God is faithful. Love that old hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness, because that's what I've seen. So I encourage you today, God is inviting us. These are troubled times, but he reminds us, he's carried us before we were even born, and he's still carrying us today. So he encourages us just to lean into him and trust him. So let's just pray, and then we'll stop here. Lord, I want to thank you for your faithfulness, Lord. It's just amazing to be reminded that you are a God who is faithful. You're a God who is powerful. And I just want to pray for those who are particularly in a difficult time in these days. I would just pray, Lord, that they would be reminded of your faithfulness, of the fact that you've carried, that you've sustained them all these years, and that we would be encouraged, Lord, by the path of faithfulness and be able to trust in you for the days to come. Lord, thank you for your great love and mercy for us. I pray this in your name. Amen.